Today we peel back the layers of history that cloaked the White House, the world's most famous residence. From whispered secrets in the Oval Office to pivotal moments that have reverberated around the globe, the White House stands as a symbol of the United States' power and enduring legacy. We are joined by Dr. Matthew Costello, Chief Education Officer at the White House Historical Association, who will guide us through the triumphs, tragedies, and untold stories nestled within the walls of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Enjoy the episode. So, Matthew, welcome to American History Gazette.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, the White House is quite possibly the most famous residence in the world, obviously being where the President of the United States resides. It symbolizes American power and prosperity, but it also holds the history of a nation. But I'd like to start the story before the White House was ever built. Going back to the founding of our country, our first president, George Washington, was unanimously elected president. And the young nation was still figuring everything out. They didn't have a capital yet. They didn't have a definitive resident for the president. So where did President Washington reside and work as president before there was a White House?
Well, it's a great question. In many ways, this story is reflective of the greater uncertainty that many of America's political and social leaders had. And at that time, the first iteration of a United States Capitol was in New York. And so Washington uses two different residences in New York before the Residence Act is passed in 1790. When that is passed, it establishes that Philadelphia will become the temporary capital for the next 10 years. And then in the meantime, they're going to be building a new federal city along the banks of the Potomac, today Washington, D.C. So Washington will use two different residences in New York. He then will use a residence in Philadelphia, which today you can still go and see a portion of this adjacent to Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell. So Washington doesn't actually ever live in the White House as president, but he plays a central role in establishing Washington, D.C. as the new federal city, and then also overseeing and approving a lot of the different specifications for the construction of the president's house.
Yeah, that's an important point to make. Washington never saw the White House, but he was instrumental in its construction. I know he chose the architect. I forget his name, but he was an Irish architect that he found.
James Hoban.
James Hoban. He chose James Hoban. He found him, met with him in South Carolina, and he chose him to build the White House. So when was the White House finished? I know during his presidency they're building it in DC. So when was it finished, and where was it chosen? Where was the location chosen in terms of its location in DC?
Sure. So it's sort of interesting because as part of the Residence Act, the three commissioners for the federal district, these were the three men who were responsible for overseeing the construction. And all three of them are acquaintances of George Washington. He knows all three of them. They are appointed to their positions. And so when the designs for the president's house are submitted, even though it really is the commissioners who select the winner, Washington makes it a point to come down to Georgetown and be present. And so certainly I think he weighs in on this, and he likely makes it known which design he prefers, which architect and builder he prefers. And so Hoban is selected, his design is selected as the winner in 1792, and construction then begins immediately that fall of the laying the cornerstone in 1792, and then continues furiously over the next 8 years. John Adams will be the first president to live in the White House. He moves in November 1st, 1800. But we sort of have a running joke here that the White House is never, it takes a while for the White House to be truly finished. And we say that because, during that process, there were a number of different things that were changed. The White House should have had another story, but that was eliminated for cost. It should have had porticos. Those were eliminated for cost. They never actually finished the East Room until Andrew Jackson's administration. So, exactly how you want to date it. Some people just say it's, when the first president moves in. That's John Adams in 1800. But for a long time, the White House was sort of an unfinished project in many ways. There were always seemed to be improvements being made and construction to be finished.
Yeah, that's a good point. In my opinion, honestly, the White House has never been completed because it's an ever evolving almost organism. It's like a living organism, all the bustle in the White House, and every administration, the president makes changes and new construction renovation. So you could say the White House was completed during John Adams' presidency, but in reality, it's an ever evolving building. But I'd like to touch on who actually built the White House because I think this is an important point to touch on. And slavery was definitely a part of this. So was the White House completely built by slaves, and how big of a presence was slavery in terms of the construction of the White House?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think if anybody's listening wants to learn more about this, please check out our Slavery in the President's Neighborhood Research Initiative, where we have an index of the people we've identified, articles about individuals, families, but also households, all the enslaved people we've been able to identify by a presidential administration. Because this story doesn't stop with construction, it continues well into the 19th century. But to answer your question, when they decided to set Washington, D.C., the new federal capital here, basically carving out land from two different states that already permitted slavery, I think some probably had to realize that enslaved labor was going to be used in these construction projects because a lot of this space was just farmland. And if you don't have the labor force here and you struggle to recruit them, it became glaringly apparent pretty quickly to the commissioners that they were going to have to turn to using more enslaved laborers to carry out timbering, clearing of the lands, brick making, even cutting out some of the stone from the croppings. Now, that said, it was a mix of a workforce. There were free and enslaved Black Americans. There were free and enslaved African Americans to the same extent, whether or not they were Black as in African and then brought here, or they had been here for some time. There were also free workers. So we had Irish laborers, we had Scottish stonemasons. So there was this very diverse mix of workers that would have been out here in Lafayette Park building the first iteration of the White House. Now, it's hard to guess exactly, what was the demographic makeup of the workforce, but between the White House and the Capitol building, which required even more laborers, I think it's safe to think that at least half of the workforce was enslaved. But at the same time, it took all these different groups of people who had different trades, and some who were willing to be here to work, and some who were forced to work to put together the president's house.
Yeah, I just think that's an important to note when talking about the story of the White House. But something interesting that I stumbled upon when doing my research was there was actually a prostitution house either at the White House or in DC operating during the construction of the White House, and it soon got shut down, but it's the only prostitution house that has ever operated near the White House or in DC. So I thought that was a comedic, interesting aspect of the construction. But it gets completed. John Adams, um, you know, inhabits the White House. He's the first president to live in the White House, and he sleeps there for one night. And the next day, he writes to his wife Abigail. And in one of the most infamous quotes in American history, he wrote, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May
May
none
none
but
but
honest
honest
and
and
wise
wise
men."
men rule under this roof.
That is exactly right. And that's just, it's one of those quotes that just go down in American history, like Nathan Hale when he was hanged, saying, "My only regret is that I have but one life to give for my country." And JFK at his inaugural address, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for a country." It's just quotes like that through American history that cement, the legacy of what America is. And FDR actually had this quote engraved in the state dining room, I believe, correct?
Yeah, on the mantle in the state dining room.
I believe that that's very poetic.
And certainly it's a statement that resonates with Franklin Roosevelt because he lives in the White House the longest of all the presidents, and a lot of presidents talk about sort of their late hours and thinking about their predecessors, people who've come before them, how they've spent their time, what they've been thinking about, what legacy they're leaving behind. And so Franklin Roosevelt has this put engraved into the state dining room mantle. But and interesting enough, if you go to the White House today, the mantle that you see was installed during the Kennedy administration. So it still has the quote, but during the Truman renovation, when essentially the White House was gutted and things were taken out, this mantle from the state dining room ended up at the Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri. And so if you go, anybody is listening, ends up, or anybody from Missouri probably already knows this, but you can go and you can see the state dining room mantle that would have been there pre-Truman renovation and has FDR's carving. And then it was later during the Kennedy administration when they created a replica of the same mantle in marble and included the same benediction.
Wow, that's awesome. And it's so poetic that FDR had this. You made a great point that he was the longest president to inhabit the White House. And he probably had to rule during the most tumultuous times in American history through the Great Depression and through World War II. So he most definitely needed John Adams' blessings during his presidency. But it wasn't until 1901 when Teddy Roosevelt signed an executive order that it was officially called the White House. Before it was just called the Executive Mansion. So why is it called the White House? Is it just because it's a big White House?
Well, and I'd like to just clarify that as well. So as far as I know, I mean, and I've never seen in like a specific executive order to this effect. I have seen him give, I guess in a way it would be kind of like an executive order, but he had his secretary send letters to the various cabinet secretaries. And he said moving forward, he asked them to essentially address things to the White House. Anything that the president needs to review or sign, that it needs to be addressed to the White House. And so he does that in October 1901. And the thinking behind that is, there are many executive mansions in the United States. I mean, pretty much either you call it a governor's mansion or you call it an executive mansion across the country. And the White House had become more, I think, of a popularly used term. I mean, many people were calling it the White House already. And that would be a way to distinguish itself from, say, executive mansion. Even earlier in the 19th century, a lot of people referred to it as the president's house. But eventually that sort of fell out of favor to executive mansion. And then, Roosevelt, I think, really thought just for consistency and then to stand out amongst all the other executive mansions to be called the White House. And so it's remained so ever since. If you get a Christmas card, an invitation to a state dinner, even just a thank you letter from the president or the first lady, you're going to see that stationery. And I think it speaks to Theodore Roosevelt is also, he is the youngest person to assume office, the presidency of the United States. He's going to embark on his own White House renovation and restoration about a year later. He'll build the first iteration of the West Wing. He's thinking a lot more about sort of transforming the home and the office, the presidency, into more like the modern institutions that we see and know today.
Yeah, that's interesting. My mistake on the executive order, I guess I may have misread that in my research, but something I really want to flesh out that maybe some people don't know is the White House was actually burned down in the War of 1812 when the Brits, in the burning of Washington, the Brits came and they torched Washington and they burned the White House down during Madison's presidency. So just walk me through the story of the White House being burned down in 1814 during the War of 1812.
So, and just a little bit of background for this, the Americans during the War of 1812, this of course was over a variety of different issues. A number of them were related to the impressment of American sailors into the British Royal Navy, but there were also long-standing tensions post-Revolutionary War. So exactly what was Great Britain doing in what is today we would call the American Midwest, but back then it was the Northwest. What are they doing in terms of allying themselves with Native Americans? Are they attacking settlements and settlers? How are they impacting trade? And so this all kind of comes to a head during the presidency of James Madison. Now, Americans have their own designs as well. There are many Americans who see Canada as a possible territory for American expansion. And so the precursor to all of this is that the Americans do invade Canada. And during the battle of what is today, it's today Toronto, but back then it was called York. The Americans set fire to the capital of Upper Canada, and so today Toronto. So really, we sort of, we burn the Canadian capital, and so a year later, now Napoleon has been defeated. The British can really fully focus on what's happening in North America as opposed to fighting multiple wars on multiple fronts. And so they invade in August 1824, and they make pretty quick work of routing the American forces at Bladensburg. Of course, there's a funny old joke with that. They call it the races because the Americans didn't fight very long and they turned heel and they ran. They called them the Bladensburg races. And although maybe it wasn't that quick, they did fight back a little bit, but they were simply just outnumbered, outmaneuvered, didn't have the resources, didn't have the leadership really to fight back against these really battle-tested Brits who had been fighting Napoleon. And so they march into Washington, D.C. in the evening of August 24th. They start setting fire to the public buildings. They start with the Capitol, and then they make their way down Pennsylvania. Now, they have been instructed to only burn public buildings. So they pretty much don't. There's a few instances where maybe some soldiers, some hot-headed soldiers get out of hand. But, for the most part, they stick to their orders and they destroy the public buildings. And it's pretty easy to spot them. Even in 1824, Washington, D.C. is not the city it is today. It's pretty easy to tell which ones are the public buildings and which ones are privately owned. And so the Capitol, the White House, the Treasury building, the executive offices are all put to the torch. And so those buildings are burned. The British don't stay very long before leaving the city. And a couple days later is when President James Madison and First Lady Dolly Madison return. They see the damage. And so even after the war, they're going to have to decide whether or not they want to rebuild the city of Washington, D.C.
Yeah, they ultimately do repair the city of Washington D.C. obviously, and the damage was extensive. I mean, the White House was pretty much just a skeleton, a charred skeleton after the Brits were through. So how quickly was it repaired and rebuilt?
Yes, and if anybody's ever seen, there's sort of a more famous colored lithograph, watercolor painting of what looks like sort of that hollowed out White House. You can see the exterior. There isn't much inside, and you're exactly right. Pretty much everything on the inside was destroyed. Only a handful of things were saved from the White House, which you can thank both Dolly Madison, but then also the White House staff and the passersby who were coming through with wagons, who managed to secure many of these things and get them out of harm's way. But the next 3 years, you'll see a rapid reconstruction. They bring back James Hoban, who was the original builder and architect of the White House, and they will rapidly replace and rebuild portions of the house. And they do it in time for James Monroe to live there. He moves back in late fall 1817, and then it's open to the public for the first time for their New Year's reception on January 1st, 1818. So the construction is very accelerated, but even though it's a great success, it's a testament to American determination and ingenuity. At the same time, eventually this will come back to haunt the future occupants because things were done quickly. The interiors were not really made heavily with brick and masonry. This time they used timbers in many places, a lot of wood interiors to help speed up the process. And so eventually, what we'll see in the 20th century, with more renovations and changes and more weight added to the structure of the house, that eventually it's going to put the residents in danger of the house collapsing on itself.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's definitely nothing else like America's ability to bounce back after facing adversity. So I think that's definitely a testament to that. And you're right. I mean, they probably expedited the process and cut a lot of corners, and that ultimately led to a lot of renovations. But something I'd like to ask you, under President Arthur's administration, they auctioned off a bunch of furniture and household items and artifacts. I mean, like 20 wagon loads sold at auction. And, as a history buff, that kind of hurts me because a lot of those artifacts probably got lost in history. So why exactly did President Arthur feel the need to auction off furniture and artifacts from the White House?
Well, you were exactly right. President Arthur did do that, but I will disperse the blame across administrations. So until 1961, that was when Congress passed legislation really definitively saying that the White House was considered a museum, and all the items within the White House and within its collection were the permanent property of the federal government. So up to that point in time, you oftentimes would see objects come and go. They stopped doing the auctions around the turn of the 20th century because by then I think it's become sort of like it's a PR thing. It also doesn't look good. But over time, all these things were just sort of relegated to government storage, and sometimes they could end up at the Smithsonian, sometimes they could end up in other places. But also, those institutions would have to, they don't have unlimited storage, so they would go through and they would cull things and take things out of the collection and either send them to auction house, get rid of them, destroy them. And so I think a big part of it is representative of how Americans, it took us a while to really sort of historicize and understand our own national identity, our origins, where we come from, and why these objects are representative of that journey. You really don't see more of a deliberate effort to really safe keep these types of things, I would say, until probably the late 19th century. And it makes sense because you're starting to see other movements in historic preservation. You have the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, who go out and fundraise, and they purchase George Washington's Mount Vernon right before the Civil War. You see something similar with the Hermitage in the late 19th century. So you see these wider movements of people becoming more historically aware of historic sites, objects, the need to have these things that are connected to important people as part of the grand American story. And so the White House is also very reflective of that because you constantly have, every 4 years or 8 years, you have new people in there who are part of that story. And so there was that part of it. The other part of it was simply that Congress only appropriated so much money for furnishings. And so even though many presidents and first ladies may have come to the White House and maybe they were more affluent people, they didn't want to spend a bunch of their own money furnishing a house that then they were going to leave in 4 to 8 years. And so oftentimes they made decisions based on, well, this is how much money Congress gave us. What needs work the most? All right, whatever's left over. All right, well, we don't like this style. We don't like that style. This chair is falling apart. If we send these things to auction and we take that money, well, we can buy new things with that money. And so you have sort of this revolving door of furnishings that are coming in and out of the White House. Some of it is their own personal items, but then some of it is, how do we update this a little bit more on such a small budget?
Yeah, I think you beautifully stated your first point that the United States population didn't really hold the White House with the same reverence we do today. I mean, all these historical events and, the founding and the building of the White House was still a lot more recent to them. So they didn't historicize it like you said. And that probably led to, them not really thinking much of it and just selling it because they did need to raise money back then to furnish the house. I'm sure there's a couple, families out there who have artifacts that were bought at the auction back then and they still have the item. It's kind of a family heirloom, but I'd definitely be jealous of those families. And building off of that the White House definitely was not the same White House we see today. People were actually able to walk into the White House and kind of walk around the White House up until I think like around World War II. People were able to just kind of walk up to the White House. I know today Pennsylvania Avenue is closed off. It wasn't the same back then. So can you explain to me kind of the situation back then if people were able to kind of just walk into the White House and meet with the president or have dinner at the White House?
Yes. So it really varies by administration, but you're right. When it comes to the 19th century, there was much more of an open door type policy for Americans to really simply just sort of walk onto the White House grounds or walk up to the north door of the White House, which was the main entrance. Over time, there tends to be more security. The initial guards are more like doorkeepers. But even then, it's only a small number of staff. And so up until 1902, when Theodore Roosevelt builds the West Wing, all of the presidents were working upstairs on the second floor of the White House. And on one end of the White House was the president and their staff. On the other end of the White House was essentially the private quarters for the first family. So a pretty small space. But the expectation had become, really from John Adams' time up until Theodore Roosevelt, that the president would be accessible to the people at any time. And this was something that even George Washington struggled with. He asked his cabinet members for advice because, as the first president, he didn't really know what would be proper or fitting. Should he be accessible all the time? His complaint was he's never going to get any work done. But if he's not accessible at all, does he leave himself open to criticism as he thinks he's a monarch? He thinks he's above the common man. And so Washington is the first one to try to navigate this very delicate balancing act between I am the president of the United States. It is a serious role, and I have very limited time, and that needs to be managed and coordinated and organized. Whereas I can still do my job, I can still meet with people I need to meet with, but also I can set aside some time within reason to meet people who are seeking me out for counsel or asking about office. And I would say moving to Washington, D.C., this became much more common because more and more people were coming to Washington, D.C. to seek appointments within the federal government. And then you also introduce reporters, members of the press. There is no White House press room in the 19th century. So, they're just kind of hanging around the grounds, trying to get some more information, trying to get a story. And so the White House is just getting more and more crowded with people who are trying to seek an audience with the President of the United States. And so eventually it gets to a point where it's just not sustainable. They have to think about better ways to regulate that. And when Theodore Roosevelt builds the West Wing, there is a little bit of criticism about now people don't go to visit the president at the White House. They go to visit him at this executive office building. It's sort of attached to the White House, but it's not attached to the White House. And, there's some people who are saying the president always does business in the White House. Well, now, of course, we see how much that's changed today because now it's you go to the West Wing, you go to the Oval Office to meet with the president. That's how it was a big meeting as opposed to going to the White House to meet the president, which today is probably generally more of a social function. So it just goes to show you that these things change and evolve over time. And accessibility has always been something that has been a very difficult thing for presidents to balance because they want to be perceived as being accommodating and being available to the people. At the same time, there's security, there's threats on the presidents and the first families. And that also, I think just in general, their own time, what could they actually do and not do and still make themselves be accessible to people today.
Yeah, it seems like a very fine line to toe for those presidents back then. You want to be a man of the people, but also you need to get work done. But obviously, over time, people are going to push the boundaries and, threats are going to be made. People are going to break the rules and it's going to give rise to security concerns. So now we see kind of the standard that we have today that the president's always shrouded in a lot of security and it's not really open to the public. But you've been alluding to it multiple times throughout this conversation. It's something I'd like to touch on now, and that is the West Wing. So Teddy Roosevelt built the West Wing Um, you know, for he built the West Wing. So basically, what is the purpose of the West Wing, and why did Teddy Roosevelt feel the need to build it?
So, as I mentioned earlier, up until Theodore Roosevelt's time, the president and their staff had to share the second floor with the first family. And so you had one half of the floor really set aside for family quarters and the other half of the floor for the president's staff. Well, over the course of the 19th century, the president's staff continues to grow, as does the power of the presidency, its influence, its impact, and also, just the paperwork. You're going to need clerks, stenographers, messengers, assistant secretaries, private secretaries. And so, with the expansion of the presidential staff, you also have Roosevelt as a very big family. And so, between him and Edith, they have, 6 children, Alice from his first marriage, but then 5 additional children. Um, and so, with all of those children residing, at the White House, in and out of the White House, going off to private school, it's too crowded. And so, what they decide to do is Roosevelt sort of rolls all of this together, a White House restoration renovation project to essentially update, restore the neoclassical look of James Hoban's White House, and at the same time, build an accompanying office building so that now the first family will have the entire second floor for them and for their guests and for visitors. And so he has this new building built by a New York architectural firm, McKim, Mead and White, and they conducted most of this work throughout 1902. And so this is the first, they actually call it the temporary executive office building, because that was just the name they were calling it. I'm not really sure how temporary they thought it would be, but it becomes clear pretty early on that even though Roosevelt will use this building for his entire administration, when his successor comes into office, William Howard Taft, he already realizes that the West Wing is too small, that the staff has already overgrown that that built office space, and so he will renovate and expand it. And then it's William Howard Taft who adds the first Oval Office. And so he adds that in 1909. There'll be another White House. There's a fire during the Hoover administration, Christmas Eve, 1929. So that it has to be renovated, rehabilitated. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt will add another major expansion to the West Wing. And so that's when we see the Oval Office moved to its current location in the southeast corner overlooking the Rose Garden.
That's interesting. So ultimately, it was a space problem. Inevitably, the staff is going to grow, like you said, big families coming in and out of the White House. So this is ultimately just the office of the White House complex where, the secretaries and the clerks work. And like you said, Taft builds the Oval Office, FDR moves it to its current location. But you talked earlier about it. By 1948, the house was declared to be in imminent danger of collapse because of, the corners cut and the resources that were used, like timber that had just decayed over time, and renovation needed to be urgently complete. And this was under Truman. So what's the story behind the Truman renovations and the Truman balcony, which I know is a staple of the White House now?
Yeah, so I mentioned it earlier that, and I think you framed the question exactly right. Um, there was a combination of the use of materials, probably doing things a little bit more quickly instead of doing things thinking about longevity. But at the same time, every time there was a new technology, let's say they moved from gas lighting to electricity, or they had to change the piping system. Every time these new things happened, as they do with homes, usually these are just new things that you put in a new construction. Well, instead you have an old home, and every time you're going to have to rip into the walls, that's also not going to help your case with the interior structural integrity. And so you're adding HVAC systems, you're adding electricity, you're adding plumbing. But really, the Roosevelt renovation in 1902, which put steel truss onto the second floor, that was a lot of additional weight that the building struggled with. And then also there was a renovation by Cal Coolidge, who redid the third floor and the roof in 1927. And by now we're further along the 20th century. They're using steel and they're using concrete. So these are very heavy building materials, and you're putting them essentially on the top of the house. And so this is where you really start to see the strain on the interior infrastructure of the White House. Now, even though that's 1927, the home continues to be standing for the next 20 years. But the incident that really sparks the Truman renovation is Margaret Truman's piano. The piano leg breaks through the floor. And so that's after that event is when Truman asks for there to be a study done of the house. And this is where you hear that quote, that it's in imminent danger of collapse. I think that, when everybody talks about these spooky things happening in the White House, that part of it was actually related to the house's structural integrity coming apart. So when they start to see chandeliers swaying back and forth, or they're hearing funny noises in the walls, I think it's probably actually the house is quite literally shrieking in pain, or it's making these noises because the woodwork is popping or knocking, and so the house is about to collapse. And so Truman is presented with a number of different plans about the best course forward. This is, of course, after he adds the very famous Truman balcony, which he took a lot of flack for. People thought that this would be a scar on the face of the White House. But if you ask people today, it's probably just as iconic. All the first families love using the Truman balcony. They love it because they actually have the privacy of using that patio, as opposed to everybody prior to that had to go and use the south portico patio, and everybody who's along the fence can see you. So it wasn't very private. But everybody that's used it has said that's one of their favorite places. And obviously that's where presidents and first families, they'll watch the fireworks on the 4th of July. So, a lot of people have really enjoyed it. And Congress wouldn't give Truman the money for it. So he took the money out of the household budget for the White House. And so he just kind of, saved money here and there where he could. And he spent the roughly $16,000 on the Truman balcony out of his own household budget to do it. But to the actual renovation, that one did require congressional approval, and they appropriated about $5.7 million to undertake this massive renovation, which took place for about 3.5 years. The Trumans moved next door to Blair House, where Truman spent a fair amount of his presidency actually living at the president's guest house. And then he moved back in March 1952, so really sort of at the tail end of his presidency. But, he was adamant that the exterior of the White House stay intact. He thought that the White House was important as a symbol. It was something that people recognized the world over. And to destroy that would be irreversible damage to what people associate in terms of symbols and ideals in the presidency. And I think also it probably helped that he was a Freemason. I think it probably would have hurt him to his inner core if he would have destroyed all the work that these stonemasons had put into the White House over the years.
Yeah, that's very noble of him to keep the appearance of the White House the same. But that's very interesting and fascinating that the thing that sparked this whole renovation was a piano leg falling through the floor. And you kind of alluded to it. Is there stories and myths or tales of like paranormal activity in the White House?
Yes, there are many. I think probably the most frequently seen specter is probably Abraham Lincoln. It seems like everybody at some point crosses paths with Honest Abe. And so you see a lot of those stories, especially, I would say, in the early to mid 20th century. And then there are instances of other people say they've experienced supernatural things. Like there's one story where somebody claims that they saw a British soldier with a torch walking on the grounds. Another story where there's sort of almost like a teenage boy who sort of sneaks up on staff during the William Howard Taft presidency. So there are these stories of like ghosts and things that can't really be explained. And another good one is the Reagans had a dog named Rex, was named after Rex Scouten, the chief usher and chief curator at one point. And Rex wouldn't go into the Lincoln bedroom. Rex would just bark at the door. So the Reagans always thought that that was like Rex's way of saying that maybe Lincoln's ghost was in the room. That I don't know if that's what Rex meant, but Rex always barked at the Lincoln bedroom. And so what does that tell us about the White House and our interactions with it? Well, it's a place that has seen a lot of the American story. And certainly we have these towering figures, people like Abraham Lincoln, that live there. And Lincoln, of course, the story associated with that is his assassination. He's brought back to the White House. This is where they have his funeral service, and before he's sent back to Springfield for burial. But also his son Willie died of typhoid fever in the White House. So I mean, there's a lot of there's tragic moments associated with the White House as well. And so because this is a story that has so much intense interest, it is connected with both history but also sort of storytelling. It makes sense that over time you're going to hear these different stories. And each time it's told, maybe it gets a little bit better, or it gets a little bit more salacious, or it gets a little bit more spooky. And so pretty soon you can get pretty far from fact pretty quickly, because, it's about the White House. And so people just kind of assume, oh, it's true because it's about the White House. Well, it's not always the case.
Wow, that is so fascinating. I mean, it's like a big, long game of telephone over time where, I'm sure these stories and myths have gotten dramatized over time. But you're absolutely right. There's so much that has happened within those walls, so many decisions that were made, so many critical events in American history, so many towering figures, like you said, Abraham Lincoln, that it really does kind of, shape the house and its legacy and its reputation. But another big part of the White House history was the Kennedy administration, and not just JFK, but his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. And she was responsible for massive restoration and redecoration. I know she was a big history buff. She appreciated the artifacts and thought that the White House was lacking, history. So she undertook a massive operation to bring artifacts back to the White House and kind of restore it and redecorate it. And this all kind of came to a culmination with her infamous White House tour, where she allowed, filmers and cameramen into the White House to do a tour of all the new redecoration she did. So what's the story behind Jacqueline Kennedy and all the redecoration that she did?
Sure. And it's a story that we know well because it's part of our origin story. The association was founded in 1961 as a cooperating association with the National Park Service, and at the request of Mrs. Kennedy. And you were exactly right. There's a few different pieces to it, but the Kennedys move in, and bear in mind, we talked about the Truman renovation. The vast majority of that money went to actually renovating the White House, and so there wasn't much left over for furnishings, interior design. Not that the Trumans were all that interested in that kind of stuff anyway. And then they're followed by the Eisenhowers. And you think about the Eisenhowers, well, Dwight Eisenhower's essentially lived an entire life in the military. They're used to living, I think, pretty frugally. And I think Mamie Eisenhower certainly was able to, she always kind of made it very clear that Dwight was in charge of the presidency. She was in charge of the House. She always told people that. And so again, she spruced things up. But again, they give you a budget, and Mrs. Eisenhower would have said, "Oh, that's plenty. I'll make it work with what I have." And so when Mrs. Kennedy comes, that's again now we have a generational change as well, right? Because the Kennedys are much younger, and Mrs. Kennedy obviously very interested in history, culture, decorative arts, fine arts. When she comes to the White House, she's not seeing a lot of this stuff. She's seen a lot of replicas, reproductions. She's not seen a lot of American artwork. And so she takes it upon herself that this becomes one of the things that she wants to focus on is what she calls a restoration of the White House and the visibility of her doing this project, the televised tour telling people more about her project, and also the fact that the Kennedys are very well connected with affluent people, um, who then can tell them, oh, we'd like to donate these antiques, we'd like to donate these things to the White House. And so she really sets up, I would say, she has the vision for turning the White House more into a museum of American artifacts and culture. And yes, there was some of that stuff in there, but it really was sort of whatever the government still had in storage, whatever they thought could be used in whatever place. I mean, there really wasn't as much thought to put all these different rooms and pieces together in a more uniform fashion. And so Mrs. Kennedy provides the vision, but really it's her successors then that really have to follow through on it. Lady Bird Johnson will do something very similar. She also does a tour. She continues her work with the White House Historical Association. She follows Mrs. Kennedy's lead with the guidebook and publishing and promoting the White House guidebook. And then it's during the Johnson administration where they create the Office of the Curator and the Committee for the Preservation of the White House by executive order. And it was Mrs. Kennedy's urging, after she leaves the White House, she writes a letter to Lady Bird Johnson, and she really implores her to continue working with the White House Historical Association to keep doing these things. And then I would say another person who probably doesn't get as much credit as they should is Pat Nixon. Pat Nixon then kind of comes into the role, and now we have Mrs. Kennedy's vision. We have Lady Bird really sort of institutionalizing these pieces. And then it's Mrs. Nixon who really, between her and White House curator Clem Conger, they acquire more than 500 pieces for the White House collection. And so they're doing a lot of work, and they do work in pretty much every room. And so again, you start to see this effect of really sort of first ladies with the help of staff, and this is trained professional staff, to revamp, restore, refurbish these spaces. Obviously, they can pick the artwork they want or the portraits they want, but it does become fairly consistent. And then I would say going forward for the 1960s and 1970s, you're not seeing a lot of big changes across the state floor rooms.
Yeah, that is so amazing. I mean, as a history buff, props to Mrs. Kennedy for taking that initiative and really cementing the White House as a museum to be, historically preserved. And you mentioned that this is kind of the last point where there's a major change in the White House. How different is the White House of the Kennedy administration different from today?
Well, certainly it's different because, since the Kennedy administration, there have been, we still have the green room, the red room, the blue room, but, those rooms have been refurbished. And so, for example, you look at the Kennedy blue room, it was more like a pinstripe wall covering configuration. The last time a blue room was changed was during the Clinton administration. And so that's one example where first ladies will, I would say more recent first ladies, they might focus on one room and do like a major project, or they might do several projects across rooms. Mrs. Trump was first lady when they replaced the red room's wall coverings. The sunlight had been coming in through those south windows and really badly faded the red room wall fabricating almost to like a pinkish color. And so those were replaced during the Trump presidency. So, I mean, it just goes to show you that really it's sort of like each first lady and their staff and the accompanying White House resident staff all work together when they establish a project that they think really has been recommended that they need to do or that they want to do. This is something that they work in tandem with the chief usher. They work in tandem with the office of the curator at the White House. And then also, it's usually something that the Committee for the Preservation of the White House will also weigh in on. And it is a way to kind of keep all these different things in lockstep, because you have the heads of different federal agencies and departments. You have the president, their own presidential appointees are on the committee. But then you also have these heads, the director of the Park Service, Gallery of Art, Smithsonian, all these different, essentially these are the people who oversee some of the repositories of America's greatest historical artifacts and treasures. And so they're all sort of weighing in on when it comes to a change within the White House, a change from both a perspective that's good for the first family, but also is it good for the public? Is it good for the museum space? All these things need to be weighed carefully before they make any type of big changes.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful precedent that has been set of, the first lady kind of taking control of maybe changes or interior design restorations, because ultimately I think that leads to a more personal feel to the home. I mean, ultimately, this is a family living in a home and they want to feel at home there. So I think it's good that they're able to kind of have that freedom to change the interior design a little bit and have creative freedom to make those decisions so that they can feel more at home. But building off of that, I want to talk a little bit about where the president actually lives. I know it's on the second floor, correct? The president lives on the second floor. So the president and his family, they live on the second floor. So how do they maintain privacy in such a public building that has the eyes of the press on them, has the eyes of a nation that's also functioning as an office building in the larger complex?
Yes, and you're absolutely right. The second and third floors are primarily for the first family and then any visiting guests that they may have, but they primarily use the second floor. And I wouldn't say there are as many. I don't want to say restrictions, but certainly on the second floor, the private quarters, the president and the first lady can really decorate how they see fit. They will use things from the White House collection, but sometimes they just bring their own personal items. If there's a bed, a couch, chairs that they really like, sometimes they will bring personal items with them to be used in the private quarters. Other times they will select things from the permanent White House collection and use those things. But I do think they probably, they keep in mind that many of these things are very old. They've been used many times. They're in different states of condition. So whatever path you want to go down with that. Um, and so that's why I think that's where the most change happens with the new administration. You won't see a lot of change on, say, the state floor. You'll see change in the Oval Office, obviously, day one, because you have a new president, and they're going to outfit the Oval Office exactly how the new president wants it to be. But at the same time, you have the resident staff and all their counterparts working around the clock to get the second floor ready for the new first family on Inauguration Day. And so by the time they get back after watching the inaugural parade and they go inside to change to get ready for perhaps the several inaugural balls that evening, when they go into the White House and they go upstairs, what they'll find is the second floor pretty much set up as they planned. They'll see family photos. They'll see their personal possessions put out in their rooms. And so they have the staff have about 5.5 hours to pull this off, and it's moving one first family out and moving another one in. And I think it's been described by one of the former chief ushers as organized chaos.
There's just a massive staff that is required for the White House's operation. And that's kind of why what I said earlier, it's kind of like a living organism, because there's so many parts that are needed for its operation. So how big is the White House staff and what exactly is their job?
Yes, so there are about 90 to 100 full-time staff of the residence. And so that is, pretty much it is the staff that work within the White House itself. And these are the roles that most people wouldn't even really think about. It is, in a way, sort of akin to a hotel, right? So, you're going to have housekeepers, you're going to have butlers, you're going to have cooks, you're going to have chefs, you're going to have florists, you're going to have calligraphers, you're going to have engineers, operations, facilities, events people, all these different people who work behind the scenes to make the White House a home for the first family, but then all the other things that a White House has to be, right? The White House has to be a stage, it has to be a museum, it has to be an office. So you have all these other people that not only have to make this place feel like a home, but also every day they're doing things that's required of them because they have an event on the South Lawn, or they're doing a bill signing, or the president is going to do a press conference in the East Room. So, I mean, all these different things that happen every day that we don't even really think about because, we just kind of see the news clips, or, we just see a little snippet on social media or whatever. It takes all these people working behind the scenes to even get those spaces into the shape that they need to be for those types of events and ceremonies and receptions. And so you have this dedicated staff, and they're there through each administration. They are not political appointees. They are, career government employees. And so really, even though they serve at the pleasure of the president, the first lady, and the first family, they are really sort of the bedrock of the White House as an institution from that perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. They are the bedrock of the White House. I mean, there's just so much that has to go into these formal events. I watched a National Geographic documentary on the White House, and it really focused on the staff and the preparations for a a visit from the Russian president for a state dinner, and there's just so much that has to go into it. So many fine details that have to be attended to that most of us, you're right, would not notice. And I watched the movie The Butler recently. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it was a fantastic movie about, an African American butler who served at the White House for a few decades, and it really gives you a perspective on kind of the behind the scenes of the White House, and it was just a phenomenal movie. But something that I'm very interested to touch on are some of the cool features and amenities that the White House has. I know that Nixon added a some bowling lanes. So what are some of the cool, features and amenities that people might not know about?
Sure. And it can vary with presidential administration. Sometimes one president adds something, another president changes it or adapts it. When we're talking about exercise, I mean, that's obviously, or, hobbies or recreation, it's very hard to just, you can't really go to Gold's Gym if you're president of the United States, right? I mean, you kind of need to pick your battles. And I'm sure Secret Service would say, hey, whatever you want to do for exercise, as long as you stay inside the White House grounds, we're fine with that. And so there have been a number of presidents who've enjoyed jogging. Bill Clinton had a jogging track laid out along the driveway of the South grounds. Now, it's a pretty small jogging track. You're going to have to do a lot of laps if you want to log your miles. But then George W. Bush, he also was a runner. He loved running, but then he had problems with his knees. So he started doing more mountain biking, and he would bike on the White House driveway as well. President Obama took what was then a basketball court / tennis court, and he converted the tennis court into a full-size basketball court during his presidency because he liked to shoot hoops. He liked to play basketball with some of his staffers. And so that was something that he enjoyed doing. FDR installed the first pool at the White House. He did this early on in his administration. That pool later would be covered over, and that is the space that became the White House press briefing room. And so if you go to the press briefing room, there is a way to get downstairs and just sort of, they kept the basement, they kept the pool intact. They didn't remove the pool. It was covered over during the Nixon administration. And so you can still go there. You can see FDR's pool that all the presidents used up until it was converted in the press room. Gerald Ford added an outdoor pool during his administration. Ford loved to swim, and he certainly wasn't going to kick the press out of the new press briefing room so he could swim. So he added an outdoor pool on the South grounds. George H.W. Bush loved throwing horseshoes, so he had a horseshoe pit installed on the grounds. So, it really, every president does it a little bit differently, what they do for recreation, what they do for fun, what they do for a pastime. Eisenhower was a huge golfer. There's photos of him. You can see him hitting balls, which looks like just from outside the South portico, hitting balls on the South lawn. He also had a putting green installed so he could work on his short game. So you mentioned Nixon with the bowling alley. That's obviously a very famous one. Nixon loved to bowl. The bowling lanes over at the Eisenhower Executive Office building, those really were supposed to be for staff, but Nixon was going over there and he was bowling a lot. And, the president of the United States wants to bowl. I mean, everybody, get out of the way. The president wants to bowl. And so I think eventually it became one of these things where, maybe it just had your own. So he had a single lane installed, which is beneath the north portico today. So you can go to the White House and you can bowl if you're a guest of the president. And that space, I think the last time it was renovated was during the Trump administration. So it's gone through a few different renovations as well.
Wow, that is so cool. And it's just a testament to the character of each president. I mean, they have their hobbies and their interests, and they shape the White House around that, like Obama with basketball and Nixon with bowling. It's such a fascinating aspect of the presidency and the White House. But something else that I find fascinating are the various protection features of the White House that you see in movies like White House Down and Olympus Has Fallen. You see underground bunkers and hidden passageways. Are these portrayals accurate? And what sort of, secret protective measures are there? Or is this top secret?
It is, well, it's top secret, but I can allude to some of these things. So, the first instance of a real fortified bunker being provided for the president was during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, and it was right around the same time the United States had just been attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor, and the White House was going to need an expansion anyway. This is where the East Wing comes into focus, and it's added. And the idea is that it could also be used for office space. And while they're simultaneously building the East Wing, it is a new office building, they build a presidential bunker underneath it. Just in the event that if the Washington, D.C. is ever bombed or the White House is ever bombed, that FDR would have a secure place to go. Now, there was a tunnel to get him to, there was another secret location in the Treasury building. But obviously, like to try to get FDR all the way to the Treasury building, you need something closer really for any president. And it needs to be within the White House complex, in order to, the best case or best chance for survival. And so they add this new presidential bunker. FDR will visit it once. He never visits it again. And fortunately, he never has to use it. Now, today, and people might be familiar with this space already. They've probably even seen photographs of it. After September 11th, when they released photographs of the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, that was part of the series of underground bunkers that are there today. FDR's bunker is part of that complex, but it has grown obviously since 1942. And you can tell from the photographs, there is a full-size conference room, there is telecommunications, spaces for supplemental staff. And so obviously it's been expanded and changed over time. There was also work done during the Truman renovation to add some of these spaces as well. Although some of these spaces are still a little, there's mentions of them, but you can't. It's very difficult to find renderings. It's very difficult to find blueprints or anything like that. So obviously these I think are still somewhat restricted because of security. But there are some great photographs of the Truman Presidential Library website where you can see that they added these very long concrete corridors that really the president can use underground. If they're all the way over in the Oval Office or in the West Wing, that they can have a faster route to get all the way to the emergency operations bunker. And so these places do exist, at least from the historical perspective. We know that they exist. We know that they've been supplemented and added onto. But what exactly they look like or what they're capable of today, that is unknown at this time.
Wow, that is so fascinating to me. I mean, I'm always, a big fan of like secrets, and when documentaries come out of, the secrets of whatever. I always find that stuff super interesting, super cool, and you see it in the movies and that just adds to the intrigue of it all. Have you ever been able to interview any presidents or past presidents about their experience in the White House?
No, unfortunately, I haven't been able to directly interview any presidents or past presidents, but the association has worked with every president and first lady since 1961. That's 12 administrations now, counting the Bidens. And so we feel very privileged to be able to do that and also be able to teach and tell stories about the White House, the people who live there, the people who work there, and using the White House as a lens for better understanding American history, who we are, and who we aspire to be.
Yeah, that's amazing. Do you ever get to go into the White House and kind of walk around and check out the historical artifacts?
I will go, anytime, for like a public tour, I'll go for those things. I'll accompany people on occasion on a tour through the White House. And, I really enjoy it because it's like, more often than not, the person that I'm with has probably never been to the White House before. It is still, to your earlier point about accessibility, even though the White House can still see up to 1 million visitors a year, I know the demand is much higher than that, and that it's not just Americans, but really people from all over the world who are traveling to Washington, D.C., really hope to have the chance to see the White House. And, you know, uh, for anybody who's out there and this is you and you really want to get into the White House, there are a few options. We do have a 360 tour of the White House where you can really sort of virtually move through every space and click on different things to learn more about the objects. And if you want something more of an in person experience, we are opening a new visitor experience this fall, September 2024, at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue, called The People's House, a White House experience. So I'd urge you to check it out. You can learn more about the project and ways to contribute or support it or visit. And we look forward to seeing you in Washington in the future.
Wow, that is so amazing. I 100% would love to visit the White House one day and be able to walk around and see this. I went to DC in September and I got to look at the White House, but I didn't get to go up to it and walk around. So that's definitely a huge dream of mine. But Dr. Matthew Costello, that wraps up our conversation. I want to thank you so much for coming on. This was such a wonderful conversation, so insightful about the White House. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jake. It was a pleasure to be here. And anytime people want to learn more about the White House, just check out our website, whitehousehistory.org. We have all kinds of interesting articles and stories, and hopefully we'll see some of you soon in Washington.